The year is 1600, a coastline in Japan. From a single battered ship, men are carried ashore, gaunt and half dead. Of a crew that once numbered over 100, only about 24 can still stand, and among them is one Englishman. What awaits him is not a welcome. That man is a pirate. Crucify him. Those are the words closing in around him. And yet, far from being executed within just a few years, this man becomes the most trusted foreign advisor in the court of Tokugawa Ieyasu, the warlord who would go on to unify Japan. He carries 2 swords at his side and is granted his own domain, making him one of the very few Western samurai in all of history. How could that possibly happen? If you've seen the FX series Shogun, you'll surely remember its hero John Blackthorne, an English navigator washed up on Japan's shores by a storm. He's just a fictional character, right? That's what most people assume. But he was based on a real man. His name was William Adams, a navigator from Kent, England. And here's the astonishing part. Much of the show's backbone is drawn directly from things that actually happened. On this channel, we dig into the madmen, the heretics, the larger-than-life figures who surface throughout Japanese history. And today's subject is exactly that kind of outlier. By the end of this video, one mystery will have an answer: how a castaway who was moments from execution became the most trusted foreigner at Tokugawa Ieyasu's side. And at the very end, I have a question I want to ask you directly. Adams's story didn't begin in glory, it began in hell. In 1598, he joined a Dutch fleet of 5 ships as a navigator bound for Asia. The goal, the spice trade. In those days, spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were worth their weight in gold in Europe, and Portugal and Spain had monopolized the Asian roots, growing fabulously rich from it. The Dutch were risking everything to carve out a route of their own and break that stranglehold. But the voyage was a nightmare: starvation, disease, storms, clashes with local peoples. One by one, the ships were lost. And in April of 1600, just a single vessel limped into Japanese waters, the Liefde, pronounced Liefde, a Dutch ship whose name means love. Of the more than 100 men who had set out, only about 24 survived to reach the shores of Bungo, in what is today Oita Prefecture in southern Japan. After landing, several more died. The brutal arrival scenes in Shogun are no exaggeration. If anything, they are close to the historical truth. And perhaps not by coincidence, the year 1600 was itself a pivotal moment in Japanese history. Adams washed ashore in April. That October, the battle that would decide the fate of the entire country took place, the Battle of Sekigahara. Sekigahara means barrier field, and it was the field where Japan's future was settled. The country was deep in a power struggle over who would rule next. After the death of Toyotomi Hideyoshi, the powerful warlord who had unified Japan before him, the question was, who would seize control? Tokugawa Ieyasu was about to answer it, and it was at precisely that moment that Adams appeared on his doorstep. But his first test was already waiting. There were already Portuguese Catholic missionaries in Japan, the Jesuits. From their point of view, these Protestant Dutch and English sailors were both rivals and heretics. The missionaries went straight to Ieyasu, the most powerful man in Japan at the time, with a warning: these men are pirates. They should be crucified. Stranded in a foreign land, unable to speak the language, barely alive, and now condemned to die. Normally, this is where the story ends, but there is a fact that often gets overlooked. What saved Adams was not strength or luck. It was the knowledge inside his own head. Once ashore, Adams was brought before Ieyasu, and then he was interrogated not just once. According to the records, it happened several times, 3 times by some accounts, with Ieyasu sitting across from this foreign castaway again and again, this is the heart of the story. Why would Ieyasu set aside the missionaries' demand to execute him and instead keep calling this shipwrecked stranger back for conversation? What Ieyasu wanted was a picture of the world. Adams understood navigation. He understood mathematics. He understood how to operate cannons. And above all, he understood European geography and the state of international affairs, how the great powers were competing against one another, and why. Think about it. At that time, Japan's only window into the Western world came through Portugal and Spain, both Catholic powers, and they were careful to share only what suited them. Then suddenly a man from the other side of that divide appears. Adams showed Ieyasu a world the missionaries had never described. Europe was not a unified bloc. Catholics and Protestants were shedding each other's blood. And behind Portugal's and Spain's missionary work, Adams suggested, there might be something far less holy, territorial ambition. Here is one way to frame it. Around that same period in Europe, Machiavelli's The Prince was circulating among the powerful. Its core idea, a ruler must deal in reality, not ideals. Use whatever is useful. Ieyasu had never read The Prince, and yet his instincts were strikingly Machiavellian. He refused to rely solely on the missionaries as his window to the outside world, and instead drew in a man from the opposing camp as a source of intelligence. He was driven not by sentiment, but by cold calculation, and that is exactly what raises the central question. Did Ieyasu keep Adams alive purely as a useful pawn, or was something more genuine taking shape? The answer lies in what Ieyasu did next. What Ieyasu gave Adams went far beyond what you would give a mere advisor. First land. Adams was granted a fief at Himi in Miura district of Sagami province, present-day Yokosuka in Kanagawa prefecture. Its yield was said to be around 250 koku. A koku was the unit used to measure a samurai's income in rice, roughly the amount needed to feed one person for a full year. 250 koku placed Adams on par with a hatamoto, pronounced hatamoto, one of the higher-ranking retainers who served the shogun directly and held the privilege of a personal audience with him. Not the standing of a daimyo, a great feudal lord, but a recognized place within the warrior class, and this for a man who had arrived as a dying castaway. And then came a Japanese name, Miura Anjin. The name carries meaning. Miura comes from Miura district, where his land lay. Anjin means a pilot, a navigator who guides ships through the sea. His original trade became, quite literally, the name he would carry for the rest of his life. Beyond that, he was permitted to wear 2 swords, the mark of samurai status. In a sense, a man died here. William Adams, the English navigator, ceased to exist. In his place stood Miura Anjin, a Japanese samurai. Among Westerners, almost no one else was ever granted samurai status in such a formal and complete way. To be precise, though, aboard the same Liefde was a Dutchman named Jan Justen, pronounced Jan Jo Sten. He too served Ieyasu. There is even a theory that the Tokyo district name Ieyasu is a corruption of his name. So saying Adams was the only Western samurai is not strictly speaking correct. Even so, in receiving all 3 together, land, a Japanese name, and samurai standing, Adams occupied a category of his own. To Ieyasu, he was no longer just a curious castaway. He was an asset woven into the fabric of the regime itself. But why did Ieyasu go that far? To understand it, we need to listen to what Adams was whispering in his ear. Now known as Miura Anjin, Adams continued to serve Ieyasu. He built a Western-style sailing vessel said to be among the first of its kind constructed in Japan. He helped broker trade with the Dutch and the English and played a role in the English East India Company, establishing a trading post at Hirado. a port town in what is now Nagasaki Prefecture. But the greatest impact he had on Ieyasu may not have come from ships or commerce. It came from words. As a Protestant, Anjin waged a quiet campaign against the Catholic missionaries, the very men who had once called for his crucifixion as a pirate. He is said to have cautioned Ieyasu that the conflict between Catholics and Protestants was real and deep, that Europe's great powers were actively expanding overseas, and that what looked like missionary work might have a political dimension. Whether that warning directly shaped Ieyasu's thinking is debated, and we should be careful not to overstate it. But look at where Japan went from there. The Tokugawa shogunate grew increasingly hostile to Christianity, eventually banning it outright, and finally imposing sakoku, pronounced sakoku, a policy of national seclusion that shut Japan off from most of the world for over 2 centuries. Could the words of one drifted-in foreigner have nudged the course of an entire nation for generations? We'll go deeper into that question in a separate video. What matters here is that Anjin was not simply a technical consultant. He was positioned to shape the worldview of the man who ruled Japan. And if that is true, then let's go back to the original question. Is this how you treat a pawn you plan to discard, or is it something else? There is one final episode that points toward an answer. Here is a fact that often gets left out of the story. Adams had a wife and daughter waiting for him back in England. He had left his family behind to sail to the other side of the world. And as the years passed, he gained the means to return. He had ships. He had trade connections. He could, in theory, have gone home. And yet he stayed in Japan. In Japan, he married a woman named Oyuki and is believed to have had 2 children, a son named Joseph and a daughter named Susanna. It is said that Ieyasu was reluctant to let him go, but that was almost certainly not the only reason he stayed. And this is where the nature of the bond between the 2 men becomes visible. If Anjin had been nothing but a disposable pawn to Ieyasu, there would have been no reason to hold him so close. And if Japan had felt like a prison to Anjin, he would have looked for the door the moment he had the means to open it. They needed each other. Ieyasu needed a man who could read the world beyond Japan's shores, and Anjin needed a place that would see him not as a pirate, not even as a foreigner, but as something more, a samurai. William Adams died at Hirado in 1620. He never set foot on English soil again. In Yokosuka today, there is a place called Anjinzuka, a memorial to the man said to have died at Hirado that year. Where exactly he was buried remains uncertain, with the leading theory pointing to Hirado itself. But Anjinzuka is the place where his memory is kept, the memory of a man who was born English and died Japanese. So let's come back to where we started. How did a shipwrecked castaway who was supposed to be executed become the most trusted foreigner in the shogun's court? The answer is this. What Adams had was not skill with a sword, not wealth, not noble blood. What he had was knowledge. And Ieyasu had the wisdom to recognize that value in a dying stranger from the other side of the world. When those 2 things came together, history shifted. Ieyasu dismissed the missionaries' accusations and coolly recognized the worth of a man from the opposing camp. That was, perhaps, pure Machiavellian calculation. But then there is Anjin, who stayed even when he had every reason to leave, and Ieyasu, who kept him close until the very end. Whatever was between them seems to have gone beyond calculation. Both things were probably true. A relationship that started as strategy became, over 20 years, something that looked very much like genuine trust. And finally, I want to ask you something directly. Back in your homeland, there is a wife, a daughter, childhood friends, a place where you are understood without having to explain yourself. And even so, Could you choose a path that meant living under a foreign name, carrying foreign swords, and one day laying your bones in foreign earth? Anjin made that choice, or perhaps it was less a choice than a slow realization that the door home had quietly closed without him noticing. No one can say for certain, but one thing is clear. The man who rests at Anjinzuka in Yokosuka was born an Englishman and died a Japanese man. One last note. There was another man aboard the Liefde who became a samurai, the Dutchman Jan Justen, and then there is Yasuke, the African samurai who served Oda Nobunaga, the warlord who first set Japan on the road to unification. But those are stories for another video.